There's a journey that Pharaoh has been going on where he feels like, I'm giving God a ton here. He actually has been making concession after concession over the plagues where he gives more and more and more to Yahweh, to God. If you remember how he started off, go all the way back to chapters 3 and 4, the call of Moses, and then chapter 4, Moses goes before Pharaoh and says, God is saying, let my people go. Pharaoh's first response is, who is this Yahweh God they're even talking about? I'm not letting you go. And instead of letting them go, he adds on more work and says, you're gonna have to make the same amount of bricks, but I'm not giving you straw because you're lazy. That's why you want to leave. There is no God named Yahweh. So he denies Yahweh. He burdens the people with greater oppression. He could care less. But then as you see the plagues coming, you see Pharaoh begin to change. And after the first few plagues, Pharaoh goes, okay, uncle, I see that Yahweh is a real God. So here's the deal. I'll let you go worship. You just can't leave the land of Egypt. And Moses says, that's not going to work. We have to leave the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh says, fine, okay, you can leave, just don't go too far. And the reason why is he wants to keep his eye on them. He didn't want them to leave and not come back, so he's going to make sure they don't go too far. Well, obviously, Moses says, no deal. God shows his power with a few more plagues until we got to yesterday where you had last week, where you had the plague of locusts. And finally, Pharaoh goes, okay, I give up. I see now that I can't stand against Yahweh. I repent. So you can go out there, but only your men can go. Your women and children, they got to stay behind. Why? Because he wanted to make sure they had to come back. He knew that if their women and children were behind, they were going to make their way back, and he would still have this slave population. And then you have the 9th plague, the plague of darkness. And again, okay, I give up. You're too much for me. All right, so now you can go. Your women and children can go with you. All I'm asking is you leave your livestock behind. And it sounds like he's being more and more faithful, more and more willing to give, more and more humble. But the truth is, he's not at all. Because everything he's doing is to accomplish the same purpose. Whether it was the women and children not going too far or leaving the livestock, everything he's doing is to force them to come back. And when he does that, he exposes what he is the most afraid of. If you're looking at the storyline, what you realize is Pharaoh isn't most afraid of the darkness. Pharaoh isn't actually most afraid of his land being ravaged. That's already happened. He's not afraid of his people getting hurt. He's not even afraid of his gods dying. The thing that he's most afraid of is losing his slave population. That's why everything he does is to make sure they come back. He's willing to endure any amount of suffering as long as he doesn't lose his slaves, because he believed every bit of his identity was caught up in ruling over the slave population. And what God is doing is exposing to Pharaoh his real fear. And in so doing, he's also exposing Pharaoh's real God, Pharaoh's idol. Pharaoh's real idol was this slave population. And he says, I cannot lose them. I will not let them go. Let me tell you why that matters. There are people who are here today. You are listening to me speak. You are watching online, and you don't even realize you have idols in your life. You have gods that have crept in that you are more afraid of losing than you are your relationship with God. You're more afraid of what it will be like not to have that thing than you are whatever consequence comes against you. And you're scared to death of giving that thing up to God. Whatever that thing is, that is your idol. That is your God. Your God is whatever you most depend on. And so whatever you're not willing to give up to the Lord, whatever you're most afraid he might ask you to give up, that right there is your God. And God will expose that to you. He will bring you to circumstances where you are forced to ask the question, am I willing or not to give this thing up? I remember the first time God did this for me. I've shared this story a number of times. I'm not going to go through the whole story again, but there was a time when I almost lost one of my daughters who had gotten into some medicine she wasn't supposed to take and almost died. And at the same time, I was being talked to at the first time about becoming the pastor of this church, and we were wondering if that was going to be what God was doing. And my greatest fear was that I was going to have to suffer the way the previous pastor did, who lost one of his children. I saw how he ministered to the church because he had been through so much pain, and I was scared to death that if God was going to call me to lead a church this big, I would have to go through the same suffering. And the moment we start talking about me becoming the next pastor, all of a sudden it looks like one of my daughters is going to die. And I just scream out to God, saying, absolutely not, I refuse. If this is the cost to be the pastor of this church, I'm out. I don't want it. If this is what it costs to be your servant, I'm out. I don't want it. I'm not willing to pay that price. Now, God was gracious to me, and he didn't make me pay that price, and my daughter is still alive. But he showed me I had an idol. I had turned my own child into a god. God does this. You know the story of Abraham and Isaac. If you don't know the story, God tells Abraham, the son of the promise, Isaac, I want you to sacrifice him. But Abraham was so much better than me. He was willing to go all the way, saying, if God's calling me to do this, I know he'll raise this child up from the dead. And God stops him in the last moment and says, I just wanted to see where your heart was. See, there are times God exposes where our heart is, and what we find is that there are idols that have crept into our lives. For many of you who are parents, it is your own children. They become your idol. And maybe it's not life and death. Maybe it's that God is calling him to go somewhere dangerous and you don't want to let him go. That's my child, God. You don't get to call them onto the mission field. You don't get to call them to go plant a church. God, you don't get to call them to choose that career. I've already got their life mapped out for them. You don't get to have them. They're mine. That child has become an idol. And God will expose that idolatry sooner or later. Maybe it's not a child. Maybe for some of you, it's a career path. You've chosen this. This is your career path. And right now, God is saying, I want you to abandon it. I want you to do something else. And you're going, no, God. You can have all this. I'll make a lot of concessions, but you don't get to have my career. This is who I am. This is my identity, God. Don't take that away from me. It's become our idol. Maybe for some of you, it's a home you live in. You've made memories in this home, and God is telling you to downsize and do something else, and you go, no, God, you don't get to take that away from me. Don't you dare ask me for that. Whatever that thing is that you're most afraid of God asking you to give up, that's where you're most in danger of having an idol. Could be money, could be a possession, could be a relationship. The Lord is saying, this is not healthy for you. And God is calling you to give it up, and you're going, I don't want to. It could be respect. God inviting you to share the gospel with somebody, but you're scared to death that you might lose the respect of your peers and the people around you. You're going, I'm not doing that. Whatever that thing is that you're most afraid of giving up, that's your idol. And that's the very thing God is going to call you to give up, just to see if you're willing or not.